Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to day one of the developer sessions at EGX Rezzed. Thank you so much for joining me. And next up, we've got a super exciting session about a very ambitious new contender in the Battle Royale genre, which is doing plenty more than that. So I'm going to stop waffling on. And before I go on, I'll hand you over to Automaton's Jamie Thompson, who's going to show you Maverick Proving Grounds.
Thanks very much for the intro. I'm James. I'm the CEO of Automaton, a studio in Cambridge, UK, where we are building Mavericks, a very ambitious new massively multiplayer tactical shooter, or of course a Battle Royale game, as you, may have become familiar with it being called over the last few years. Let me just briefly summarize what Mavericks is and sort of what our key ambitions with this project are, because there's some stuff that's been very big in the industry in the last couple of years. But we see Mavericks in a slightly different way to what you might be used to from a Battle Royale. So we're building Mavericks in a sort of very new kind of massively multiplayer technology platform. And so we have a big focus on a very dynamic kind of world. It's huge. This is the Proving Grounds. It's a sort of 150-kilometer square playable area with a sort of central persistent social hub on one sort of small part of the map in the center. And our focus was deliver a strong first and third-person shooter experience in sort of Battle Royale game mode with sort of great performance on a larger scale that's been done before, but also, crucially, in a much more tactical way than what's been done before, because we have sort of detailed simulations of the world and how you can use that to your advantage, and much more information available to the player to make strong decisions throughout the game that affect the outcome. Of course, it's also a persistent world. We have a capital social hub, and we're also we've got progression systems that exist outside that session-based experience that enable you to sort of show off and trade and sort of display to other people what you are good at in the game, and also sort of be part of more of a community, as you may be used to in a sort of more traditional MMO-RPG, which is the background of many of the people in our team. So just a little bit about what this world is at a conceptual level. The Proving Ground, you see the sort of capital island at the top there, where there's sort of social hub, and the sort of backstory is that there's a capital that are controlling this island that you're on, participating in these games, and there are some rebel factions out there in the lands. We're actually evolving Mavericks into a sort of more persistent RPG experience as well towards the end of 2019, when we launched this sort of more RPG elements of that game, and we believe that this sort of merger between a strong competitive session experience with the backdrop of an RPG, a very player-focused, evolving RPG landscape, like they together build a really awesome experience, not by trying to mix those two things together, so you still have competitive play and you have open world play, but to create an interesting and intuitive sort of evolving landscape in which to play these sorts of tactical, massively multiplayer sessions. And that also reflects in how we're sort of approaching the building of the map. So just going back to this sort of overview quickly, we have kind of templates that we build into small areas of the map. So if you say zoom into a segment, we're using this sort of small island outside the social hub as a test bed a lot in our alphas, and saying, look, we have these modular pieces that are more like a traditional shooter map, like sort of that 1, 2, 3 stage process there where we build that sort of the logging camp. But we think about that from a game flow point of view. And then we use these templates throughout the map so that we can more efficiently build a scalable tactical experience that can take place over such a big space without it feeling like it's just some random stuff blatted around a large map. But of course, that's a huge amount more than that's been done at high performance in any game out there today. So there are a couple key areas that our engineering teams had to focus on to make this game possible. And we have two really great partnerships as well in these areas. And the first is with Improbable and their platform Spatial OS. If you've not heard of it, it's a distributed sort of compute platform that enables you to move from a traditional single client server architecture that constrains how much you can do in a game to one where you instead have multiple different servers computing different sections of the world, and Spatial OS then handles the networking side for you and also stitches together the results of those computations. So we use a whole cluster of servers to simulate the server side, and that really sort of enables us to remove the limitations that there are both on player counts and how much you can really do to keep the world high fidelity and have a large amount of simulation. So say I'm a player, like any of these dots could be a player or another entity in the world. These different servers are actually responsible for small sections of the world. And here's an example where there's sort of a single white entity there moving throughout the world and being handed off between different workers that it's simulating. So that's sort of the basic idea. If you look at, for example, a player, just for a little bit more technical detail in one area, a player is a kind of living entity, and your client, your game client, actually connects into this swarm of servers, and both your client, other clients nearby, and the simulation workers for that part of the world both sort of collaborate to make this player simulate both in high fidelity and in a way that's efficient over a large space. So what happens is the client can summarize what your input has been into the game and say how you're moving, and sort of apply animations. So it will recognize that you're on the ground, and so will every other server. And because it knows that constraint, I mean, this is a slightly simplified example, but because it knows that you're on a particular kind of ground, it's more efficient about predicting what kind of network traffic to send. And it's also able to both enable you to do some like latency compensation without sort of putting too much power on the client. So we can summarize a lot more data and therefore do kind of sort of deep anti-cheat kinds of technology where we send everything like down to the detail of how you're aiming to the server for short periods of time, and blend that by having different workers responsible for different activities. And so this sort of approach where everything you see is actually a layered simulation between different kinds of servers, and your client only has to do so much of that, enables a very different approach to synchronized sort of player rendering. And again, this is sort of the heart of why we're very different to sort of a Battle Royale game today, where it's really using the same basic technology that a shooter that's designed for 12 players is using, which gives you significant limitations. And another example where you see it sort of in Spectre or Spatial OS on the right, where footprint trails and foliage displacement's been left by this player walking through the world. And that's something which, again, you move into that area as a client, and then all that sort of data becomes apparent as you move into that space. And we're able to sort of summarize that efficiently across the network. And these layered simulation techniques affect Mavericks in a number of ways, from dynamic time of day and weather, so that weather then forming puddles and changing the landscape of the terrain, volumetric fog that affects visibility, destruction systems, tracking systems, substance and fire propagation, and then of course the vehicles and even wildlife. So these different things that can alert you about what's happening in the game. But of course, like some of that stuff needs some great rendering technology, and that's where we're working with CryEngine and their team on what's been a seminal real-time rendering engine in the industry for a number of years. It's been fantastic at rendering fully real-time, where you don't sort of light bake and make things static to improve efficiency. Everything can be done real-time, and what that allows us to do is stream in the world as it comes, and that's extremely important because we have extremely high fidelity in this game, and that means that we have to support only rendering what you need, and the combination of what CryEngine is very strong at and what we're able to do through Spatial OS is what enables us to have high fidelity and high scale. And the other side of what we do with the engine technology is use the more modern workflows of physically based rendering and photogrammetry. So what that means is that we can get assets from online outsourced plus scanned in ourselves from photos, and by using charts and physically based models, we can bring all of that together and keep it looking consistent, even though the assets have come from a number of different places. And that means that we can build the game substantially faster than a game would typically be built just a few years ago. So effectively, what that means, if I try and talk over the gunshots, but what that means is the game's really about enabling more strategy. We're going to be talking about how this really comes together and showing some demo content at E3 this year. But to give you a bit of a preview as to what this really means, I've talked about a number of different kinds of layered simulation techniques. We see that as making a very different gameplay experience because these different things you can do to the world can inform other players with much more information. We're looking at a number of kinds of objective systems that really push the amount of information available to players across the world, so that rather than just sort of random loot-based RNG, that's slightly reduced, and you sort of can learn a lot more about what other players are doing in the world, and as a result, track them down in our sort of houses, full siege-based gameplay across the map. Being able to use both audio, visual cues, the systems of foliage being displaced, footprints being left, and just sort of everything layered together means it's a tactical gameplay experience, and that sort of mid-game, isn't just a bit of exploration and you may happen upon a player. It's one where there's a lot more you can do based on the information provided across the game, and that's really our focus with Mavericks. It's making the open world gameplay tactical through what players are doing to each other through the world, not just by shooting each other. And of course, these sort of new technical techniques, which I've outlined both on the sort of server side and through sort of streaming-oriented uses in CryEngine and fully real-time rendering, mean that we can still achieve really great high performance, high frame rates with higher detail and not be as constrained in terms of the number of players. Doesn't mean that Mavericks is only set out to have a 1,000-player game type. We're able to actually support this sort of flexible model where it might be more fun for a standard online session to play 100 to 400 player games. You sort of have that right balance of session length. But then for events, we can do massive scale games, and we can also have different considerations for even professional play. But all these things come together in the same game, but just played out over different portions of the map, different time scales. So we really think of this as one gameplay experience unified through the world, but able to be sort of more flexible in terms of how it's presented. And then you can take that experience back out into this sort of social MMO area, this place where your character really progresses. There's player trade through the economy of the game, and these sort of rewards that you get that may be bespoke to the sort of achievements you have in the game, or they may be, you're able to be wealthy and get, through our clothing systems, stuff that really matters, and really show that off to other players around you through, again, what you consider to be perhaps a more traditional MMORPG landscape, but sort of seamlessly within a game world that's being used for these competitive session-based games. You're not taking that stuff in to a competitive session, making it sort of unfair. It's not that kind of progression. It's progression where you're able to show your progress more effectively and be part of this sort of community beyond just the individual sessions. So you don't join this world through a menu, actually, you join it through that social hub and that sort of shared space. So, as I mentioned, like our key date really for showcasing Mavericks and how this all comes together into a gameplay experience is going to be in June, where we're doing that at E3 and launching our trailer. But I've talked about a few kinds of technical systems we're using. You can also find out more at our website. But I'd love to answer any questions if you have any about sort of how we're making Mavericks possible. So I think we have a microphone.
We do. Thank you so much for that. It's super interesting, and can't wait to find out more. We do have a microphone, which is going to be placed in the center of the aisle down there. So if you have any questions, just form a nice orderly queue, and I'm sure we'll be able to get to them. Just to start off, I guess, it's an absolutely huge game. How big is the team exactly that's working on it?
So we have a team that we started, previously myself, Mark Gerhard, our chairman, was CEO at EGX. We did sort of RuneScape and other MMO projects. Since then, we brought on various people from both the AAA side, other MMOs. But we're still a team of 40 people, which is very small for this kind of game. But that's because of a number of things. Like the art side, again, we can use a lot of outsource. We can bring in a lot of assets because of the fact that we have the quality bar in-house and these charts that allow us to calibrate stuff. So it's sort of misleading. The teams we're working with on some of the tech that we're doing are also very large and dealing with very complex problems. We're a very focused team that's building out building all this great stuff together into sort of what makes the best experience. We have, many, many years of great stuff from what, CryEngine has delivered. We have, in Problems Space OS, we have a huge engineering team working on distributed systems that we're working with very closely. But Automaton's a very focused studio, and we're all about next-generation MMOs. So we're gradually growing, but, we're focused more on having the right people than sort of growing a large team.
Yep, makes sense. Go ahead.
Hi. I just got one question. It's what are exact plans for the open world gameplay, and does that include like building or military simulation type of game modes as seen before in Arma franchise, and what is your idea for it?
So the persistent open world, which happens outside these sessions, is something which we're really pushing a lot more towards the end of next year. But there will be an initial experience this year because you have the social hub where you have player-oriented progression. You can go out and risk your stuff in an open world session, which is more sort of free form. That's like the basis that we're launching later this year that comes along with the game, and that for us is an interesting experiment where we're really keen to make sure that we react to what players are doing in this world. So we're focused this year on session-based play and also having the analytics platform to understand what players are doing within our games so that the open world persistent side can be managed very well because having worked on previous MMOs, it's all about understanding what your players are doing and reacting to that. So our plans next year are to have the factions form a baseline global narrative, and each year the overall narrative of the game will change, and that will change the landscape of the game, and that will also affect the sort of Battle Royale session side of the gameplay. So we have this sort of year-long evolution that happens, and that's actually incorporating what players have done within the world, how that's affected the capital, what that's meant for the island as a whole. So we have some quite strong RPG-oriented plans for 2019. This year it's more about sort of introing to the world, people getting to know the social hub, people to sort of start risking their gear and fighting in the open world in a pretty free-form fashion, and then we're sort of evolving that over the time with the community.
And is the combat going to be based on first-person way, or is it going to be a bit more like tactical? Or is it going to be a bit more tactical than what we've got at the moment? So it's third-person from what we've seen, and then going forward, is it going to be more comparable to Arma experiences, or how far do you want to push the realism of the combat further?
So in the social hubs, we focus on third person so that you can show off your gear, and that's why a lot of our initial gameplay has been showing some of our third person animation, because these aren't the final animation sets in the game, but actually inside the gameplay session, we have both first person and third person shooting as options. We actually believe that first person will probably be a stronger bias within those gameplay sessions than third person. So even though we've shown some clips here and there of third person animation, actually it's first person shooting that's the focus. We just are keen to sort of do a big reveal of our gunplay at the right time, and that's something that we're looking to do at E3. So yes, it's a first-person game with third-person components. Social is about third-person because you want to be able to see your character and your progression as well as everyone else's. But while we'll offer third-person, we think first-person will actually be the focus of the Battle Royale side of the game.
All right, thank you.
No problem.
Spatial OS seems like a huge part of what you're doing with this. Was it a case of you were kind of looking for the right technology to implement your game idea, or did you kind of see Spatial OS and think, what can we do with this?
For the most part, we knew the kind of game we wanted to build before we started working with Improbable and Spatial OS. I think it's very much helped our timelines and make it much more feasible to do a lot more of what we wanted from Mavericks much faster. As with any of these sort of MMO projects, that there's been some evolution. I'd say our ideas, we started working with Improbable just over a year ago. It's evolved over that time, but I think we had the core ambition there before that. We wanted to create an action-based, massively multiplayer experience that truly is massively multiplayer. Like, it's not just you come across. There might be 100 players in some sort of games, but it doesn't mean that they're actually interacting, that there's any meaningful interaction through all those players playing together in the same space. And we had this focus of being able to actually leverage that and create an experience that just wouldn't be possible without a lot of players playing together in the same space. So the core tenets of what Mavericks is, we decided before that point. Yeah. But Spatial has been much more about removing constraints, much earlier on in development than we otherwise would be able to.
Cool. I can't wait to find out more. It looks absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for coming to join us. Hopefully we'll see you again here in this room a bit later on. But for now, a big round of applause, please, for James.
Thanks very much.